So we're going to continue to learn about the drum rack and go a little more in depth in this video. We have a new template going on in Ableton, so we're going to start from scratch. So let's grab the drum rack from the drums folder. I'm just going to drag it onto that MIDI track. As a quick review, we've got three different main views. We have the macro, the chain, and the device view. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab a couple samples and we're going to throw it into the drum rack and just kind of build out one from scratch. So I like to build a lot of drum racks from scratch just because I have more control over the samples rather than just loading a preset and having to delete a couple things. So, I mean, it really comes up to your own workflow. As you continue to produce, you'll kind of come up with your own workflow as you go. One thing I highly recommend is layering sounds to make them really fat. So with the drum rack, we can layer two kicks together to make it sound really big and thick. A lot of good producers these days are layering their sounds to make them sound really thick and big. I'm sure you've listened to songs where the drums or synths or instruments sound really weak, and layering is super key today to make big fat sounds. So one thing I'll think about when I'm layering sounds is I'll think of terms of lower frequency and a higher frequency. So that kick sounds pretty rich as far as the punchiness in the top end. It's got a little bit of a low thump to it. It sounds very digital. So I like the LD kick. It sounds very raw, like a real actual kick drum. It sounds more natural, and they complement each other because they have two different tones. The LD kick is a little more mid-range and it sounds more realistic, and the kick that we just loaded in the drum rack sounds a little more digital, and it's more punchy in the high end and really thumpy in the low end. So if I hold down Command and I click and drag a sample into the drum rack, which you can do, by the way, from your desktop or anywhere on your computer, you can just drag and drop a sample straight into the drum rack, which is pretty cool. And it doesn't even have to be a drum sample. It could be anything, like a loop that you would grab from a sample pack or a vocal or something else. So now this is what's called an instrument rack. An instrument rack allows us to layer multiple chains together, such as instruments, presets, or in this example, two different kick drums. So now they're just one big happy family. It's a kick sandwich, pretty much. So now it sounds really big and fat, and I can solo one or the other to hear what they sound like. But together they sound much bigger. So I can adjust the volume of each one individually. So I might turn this one down a little bit. Let's go ahead and get a clip going. So I'm just gonna draw in with my pencil tool or something. Let's go ahead and grab like a clap sound or a snare. So we'll just drag that down into a blank cell slot. And I might find something that has a little more mid-range that complements this clap. So keep thinking in terms of frequency about how they complement each other rather than grabbing any random sample. So let's try this with the other clap. And now we have both of these sounds sandwiched together like the kick. So whatever sample is selected, you'll see the instrument rack over here on the right with the two chains. And like I mentioned earlier, an instrument rack is just basically creating multiple chains of layering sounds together. You can use it for a lot of other things, but we'll dive deeper into that another time. And I'll just adjust the volume. This is a good way to get fat sounds. And I feel like not enough people are doing it in the music world, especially those starting out. So I went ahead and created this clip, and we've got the strum loop going on. I added a couple of hi-hats. Everything else is pretty much the same. It's pretty basic. Now if I go back to the drum rack, the shortcut, remember, to go back between the clip and device view is Shift Tab. So remember, shortcuts are our friends. It's going to save you a lot of time. Or you can click the view in the bottom right corner. So we've got another view inside the drum rack that we haven't discussed yet. And when you open up the chain view in the drum rack, you'll notice on the bottom left, we have those three things. We have the in and out preferences, which we looked at already, which we can control choke and a couple other features. So we can assign two different samples to the same number so they interact with each other. And then we also have what's called our send and returns. So just like we have sends on individual tracks, so everything going through that track for that instrument, it has its send knob, which is sending to one of these return tracks that we have, which is for effects most of the time. And instead of sending using our send A or B to the entire track, we can get a lot more control sending individual samples within a drum rack. So when I hit play, notice it's sending the hi-hat, snare, and kick all to that reverb. And typically, you don't do that a whole lot unless you're doing a bus mix. But just for fun effects, that's what we're talking about here. So we can get a lot more control using return tracks and sends within the drum rack itself. So one trick that I use a lot, which is pretty fun, is the ping pong delay. If you open up these views down here on the bottom left in the drum rack, you'll see we have this thing opens up. It says drop audio effects. And now I can drop an audio effect like this ping pong delay. And it creates a ping pong delay chain just for this return track. So the first time you drop something in, that's going to be your return A. You'll notice when you drop a new audio effect in the return track area, that send window opens up for all of the chains in the drum rack. Another thing to note is when you drag and drop something maybe from your audio effects folder into there, a lot of times it defaults that effect to this dry wet knob of like 40 or 60%. And when you're using an audio effect on a return track, on any return track, whether it's the drum rack or one of our return tracks over there, you always want it to be 100%. And here's why. Because if I'm sending or blending this one sample and I'm sending that into the ping pong delay I just put in there, I send 100% to that ping pong delay, but the dry wet's only at 50%, we're only getting 50% of that ping pong delay effect for that sound. So it's much better to set it at 100%, and then we can just blend in everything else exactly like we want it to be blended into that ping pong delay so we get the full signal. We'll go more into the audio effects in a different course another time, but if I pull down the feedback knob, this is basically how many repetitions is going to happen over and over as the delay is happening with whatever sample we're sending to it. So I'll just kind of set it around 20%-ish, sometimes 30. And now I can send any sound I want to that ping pong delay and create some really cool rhythms and effects and make it bounce around. So let's try it. I also encourage you, when you're playing around with an effect, always overdo it and back it off to taste so you can really hear what it's doing. So I'll turn it all the way up and pull it back to where I think it sounds good. So it's very subtle, but it adds a little bounciness to the track. I love the ping pong delay. You can do that for anything, hi-hats, whatever. You can send other stuff to it. And when we talk about automation, this is going to be really key. So remember this when we get into the automation part of the course, is automating your sends in your drum rack. It's a super fun way to create effects and movement and rhythms throughout your track and clips.